So for one, I have not read the original novel to this series, No Longer Human. Instead, I read the 2 manga adaptations of it because I am a manga channel. And I actually finished reading this series about like 2-3 weeks ago, although I just got so caught up in watching, reading other stuff, and doing other stuff on the channel that I never got around to this video. But the Flowers of Evil video did really well, so here we go. Now, No Longer Human is originally written by Osamu Dazai, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right, so for you weird people who get all self-righteous and turned on by correcting people for not pronouncing foreign names correctly, go ahead and have at me. But if I'm not mistaken, after writing this series, the author would then go on to commit suicide by drowning himself, if I'm not mistaken. And what was really weird is I found out that information after reading one of the adaptations of this manga, and that is the Junji Ito version. Junji Ito incorporated the author himself within the story, and then later goes on to depict the suicide attempt that the author would commit. And like I said at the beginning, I am going to be talking about the 2 adaptations of the original novel, which is, I'm pretty sure, a best-selling hit in Japan, one of the best-selling novels ever. And so I will be talking about the Junji Ito adaptation and the Furuya Usamaru adaptation. Now, it might seem a little weird to read 2 different versions of the same story. However, I will say that the Usamaru version is a much shorter, condensed one, seeming more like an outline to the Junji Ito version, which goes much more into depth with the character. In Junji Ito's version, the protagonist of the story seems a whole lot more like just a terrible human being as life continues, versus the one in Usamaru's version seems more like a victim of his circumstance who nonetheless still took the wrong decisions. The name of our protagonist is Oba Yozo, but throughout this video I'll just refer to him as Oba. In the Usamaru adaptation, the story of our protagonist is shown through these notes that the protagonist himself has left behind. Now, at the end of the video I'll get into which version I like the most, but I'll just say for this one, as for the notes being left behind, it would explain the very time skip feel of this version, and I actually kind of enjoyed it nonetheless. But our protagonist is essentially this rich young dude who kind of has a hatred for people. As he says himself, he finds people as gross, and through art he depicts people for what he sees them as. He seems to be somebody who hates his own father and kind of feels like a puppet held by these strings, not necessarily feeling like an actual human himself. As you can imagine, this is a very psychology heavy series, and you could throw it in the same category as a Flowers of Evil, Homunculus, and Punpun. In other words, the I don't know if I should be reading this category. Now, from what I was able to research, apparently the original novel seemed to be an autobiography of the author's life, and even though I kind of get that from this version, I would say that feels a lot more accurate in the Junji Ito telling, although of course Junji Ito added a lot more horror elements into it. However, in this one, you feel a lot more bad for the protagonist, although you can of course see Oba's very questionable decisions, the things that will eventually happen to him throughout this entire manga just makes you feel a lot more compassionate towards his case. He seems like somebody who never really had someone he could truly have a friend, and wasn't just surrounded by people who were either judging him or he was judging, or people who were trying to leech off of him. Throughout the series, you'll see our protagonist indulge himself in these pleasures in order to escape the actual issues that he's going through. And I think I can say at this point, whether real life or in a story, that usually doesn't end well. One of the recurring themes that happen in this adaptation, and I'm pretty sure in the original novel now, and in the Junji Ito adaptation, is the theme of suicide and trying to attempt suicide. And I think what makes this version probably the easiest to connect to is the illustration and the setting seems a lot more modern. Oba seems like any other teenager or any other young person. I think the true strength, though, of this adaptation is showing the theme of no longer being human. Hence the title. It really shows the inner feelings of the protagonist, the way that he views the world, and at times how the protagonist views himself. Things like love, pleasure, intimacy all kind of bleed away, and now again he's this empty, hollow puppet. There's not really much else for me to say without really getting into the spoilers or making this major analysis video. Not the point of this video again. But now I think I can get into the Junji Ito version. Now, Junji Ito is known for his horror elements and horror manga, which is something he really incorporates within the series. As I said with the previous one, the theme of no longer being human and kind of losing your humanity, but with this one you can really see the author try to focus focus in on the guilt of the protagonist and kind of the haunting and horror aspect of a human being and taking the wrong decisions. You get to see the protagonist be haunted by the ghosts of his past and his past mistakes, and I'm not saying that as like that it actually happens within the manga. In this version, you get to meet our protagonist since a little kid, versus in the Usamaru version, you get to meet him more so when he's a lot older. So in this version, you meet our protagonist Oba when he's a kid, and you learn of things he goes through like sexual abuse. However, as soon as you kind of go past that, you learn to really hate the character pretty quickly. And I know that sounds wild to say, but I really can't get into it without spoiling, although for those who know, they know exactly what I'm referring to. However, that feeling of sympathy is still there, not nearly as much as the Usamaru version. Now, what both versions do well, however, in this one, it starts from the childhood, and in the Usamaru version, it starts more so at a high school, college age, and that's the protagonist making people laugh and doing things on purpose, acting naive and stupid on purpose, just to please other people, not really being able to be himself and losing the identity of who he really is. It's essentially the class clown who pretends to be all happy and joking, but then gets home and is probably the most depressed one in the classroom. That's exactly the scenario here. And so not necessarily having a real identity of who he is or what he is capable of as a kid, you see that translate in the Junji Ito version throughout his teenage years and his adulthood, where, as I already mentioned, the protagonist does not make very good choices. However, in this one, it goes into great lengths as depicting our protagonist here as incompetent, crappy, and just a terrible human being all around, even though ironically he's no longer human. Constantly abandoning people left and right, cheating on lovers, ruining his lovers' lives, ruining the lives of other people, joining radical movements just cuz. So yeah, in this version, even though it's a lot more fleshed out and adds a lot more to the character, it also makes you really hate the protagonist a lot more. And it's really cool because Junji Ito, again, incorporating these horror aspects, kind of shows the different versions of hell and how all of his sins drag him through these different stages. And I think the coolest aspect of this version, as I mentioned before, is that Junji Ito goes as far as to incorporate Osamu Dazai himself into meeting the protagonist Oba, which for me was a really cool dynamic after learning about the history of this novel. In fact, the manga begins with the suicide of Osamu Dazai. Yeah, it's pretty wild. And well, as for the fate of Oba himself in the Junji Ito and Usamaru version, well, that's kind of left for you to figure out and read for yourself. Now, I think both adaptations are solid, and I really enjoyed both of them. I did read the Junji Ito one before reading the Usamaru version, and I was really able to enjoy the series nonetheless, so I don't know if you want to read it in that order, or maybe in the other order, start off with the shorter version, which is Usamaru's, and then get into the longer version, and then maybe even read the novel for yourself. But I will say, even though I think Junji Ito is a lot more fleshed out, there's more to it, there's a lot more to analyze, I kind of have, I'd say, a preference, and I definitely enjoyed the Usamaru version a whole lot more, and I'd probably go back and read that one. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you are new to the channel, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and turn on the bell notifications, that way you're notified whenever a new video pops up on some of your favorite anime, manga, or whatever content. As always, this has been The Masked Man. Hope everyone has a blessed rest of the day, and peace.